And good afternoon. It's Dr. Roddenberry coming to you from Willow Springs, North Carolina. How's everybody out there doing? If you're in my audience, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar if you will. Let me know you're here. Hope everybody's doing fine. We are now into goodness me, this is the 5th module of the class. Born That Way. We're going to be talking about nature and nurture. This module. And yes, of course, I kind of stole the title from Lady Gaga's song Born This Way. Actually, all of my modules, I, Robot is a famous short story. Am I Evil is a Metallica song. So all of my themes sort of have a music or cultural reference. And this week we're going to be talking about nature or nurture. If you're here, let me know if you can hear the broadcast if I'm coming through. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started today. Born This Way. We're talking all about human development. And you'll see I have this one person here. That is you, whoever you are in the audience. That is you, that one unique person sitting in a great field of all kinds of other people who are different from you. And we're going to talk about how you get that uniqueness and what it's a product of. Now, first, let's go ahead. Let me switch to my camera up here. This chapter is going to cover the developmental psych chapter, which is chapter 9, and then hold on real quick, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be doing this in front of you, and chapter 6, which is the learning chapter. Okay, and we're going to be talking about chapter 9 and chapter 6. Now, lifespan developmental psychology, it's a multidisciplinary study that seeks to understand how the human being changes from birth to death. How do we develop? What are best practices? What are the issues that people face as they go through the different periods of their life? And so lifespan development is interested in how human beings change as they grow older. Now, why do we care about this? Well, if you think about it, human beings are a stock or a crop, just like any animal or crop you might grow out there, a field of corn. You want them to grow as healthy and produce as much, be as vibrant as possible. You can think of your high school class of students as a crop of students. And we want them to grow up and to experience health and well-being over a very long and happy life. Now, this is very important. I don't know if you knew this, but in 1900, the turn of the 20th century, the average lifespan was only 47 years of age. I don't know if you know about it now, but the average lifespan now for adults is about 78 or 79 years of age. Can you see how much we've improved the quality and length of life in a little over 100 years? And now here's the deal. It's more about living a long life too. It's also about well-being. It's about feeling good. It's about feeling productive. It's about keeping your mind. It's about being happy. And if any of you folks have ever looked at older family members, you'll notice that they can vary on those 3 dimensions: how productive they feel, how happy they feel, and how physically healthy they feel. All 3 of those are important in creating a healthy human being that experiences well-being. Now, human beings change along 3 broad dimensions. And if you look in a developmental psych class, actually, if you take my developmental psych class, I teach that every year or so. It's a follow-up to this class. We're actually going to focus the entire semester on how human beings change. And it turns out that human beings, broadly speaking, we study how human beings change on 3 dimensions. We study how their bodies change, how the nervous system, specifically for me as a psychologist, I'm interested in how the nervous system develops and matures and how this affects our behavior. Okay, now I'm also interested, remember we talked about last week how important the cognitive perspective is in psychology. One of the important topics in developmental psychology is trying to understand how people's cognitive ability develops. That is to say, what kinds of intellectual tasks can a 2-year-old not do that a 4-year-old can do? What are the kind of cognitive tasks that a 4-year-old can do that an 8-year-old can't do? And cognitive developmental psychologists also ask the question, how do we lose our mental abilities as we get older? Yes, your mental abilities do change and decline as you move into later in life, as you move into late adulthood. But there are patterns in which that happens. And we're going to talk about that later today if we have time. And so we're interested in how human beings' mental abilities change. And then we're also interested in how people's personalities and socio-emotional functioning changes. If you've ever been around a 2-year-old, you'll notice that they do not have the same personality and emotional control, hopefully, that a 10-year-old does. And things that bother an 18-year-old adult don't seem to faze the 50-year-old adult. How does our personality and our emotional functioning change as we grow older? So developmental psychology is the branch of psychology that is interested in studying how people change physically, mentally, and emotionally over the course of their lifespan, with an eye towards helping people have the healthiest life possible. Do you understand this slide right here? This is the whole point of what developmental psychology is. I see that Nelissa's here. Hi, Nelissa. Thank you for checking in. If you're still there, go ahead and type another hello in the chat bar and let me know that you understood what I said on the first chapter. Now, one of the biggest, most important questions that we're going to answer, a philosophical question. If you go back to chapter 1, and I talked to you about all the philosophical theories that find themselves pervading psychology. The question is, are people born the way they are, or does their environment change them, right? Is that person who breaks the law and robs a bank, are they inherently a bad person? Or is there something about their environment that affected them and caused them to turn out to be a bad person? Do college-born neurophysicists, are they born or are they trained? So we're going to ask this very, very important question. Which is more important? Is it our genetic nature, our genes, or is it our nurture? The last writing assignment that you just did, the Kallikak study, was directed at trying to figure out whether or not people's genes were what affected their intellectual abilities. His study of, quote, moronism and feeble-mindedness. He thought it was caused by genes. So if you looked at Henry Goddard's theoretical background, he would believe that intellectual ability is inborn and not learned. Now, if you did the correct analysis of that study, what you're going to suggest is that he did not use an experimental method. Not only did the offspring of that gentleman, Mr. Kallikak, have different genetic abilities based on their different mothers, but their mothers also lived completely different lives. The one mother was a very rich, wealthy woman with all the advantages in the world, and the barmaid was poor and probably struggled with disease and poverty her whole life. So the environment was different from those children. And in fact, one of the most important questions, Nelisa, that has the reason I gave you the IQ, the hereditary genius assignment from the second chapter, is because this question of whether IQ is genetically determined or created by the environment still is an argument that is still hotly debated even now, right here in the 21st century. And this is one of the important developmental issues that we're going to talk about. And some famous naturalists, Charles Darwin, of course, believed in the theory. He created the theory. He developed the theory of evolution. Remember, his nephew, Frederick Galton, was the founder of social Darwinism and one of these hereditary genius supporters. And we're going to compare them this week with a fellow named John Watson. Actually, we're going to compare him in about 15 minutes with John Watson, who was a strict behavioralist who thought that your total outcomes, whatever happened to you in your life, was really more of a function of your environment than your genes. And so we've got this nature-nurture debate that we're going to talk about. Okay, Nalisa? But before we go on, what I'd like to do is start by talking a little bit about what we know as the nature, the genetic change of human beings. You can think of human beings as a process of two qualities. Okay, let's go back to this, Nalisa. Human beings develop from babies into who they are. They definitely change. Human beings change from the time they're born to when they're adult. If you look in the mirror and you look at your baby pictures, Nalisa, you'll see that you changed quite a bit. Now, some of that change is due to what we call maturation. That is genetically programmed change. A great example of maturation is puberty. We all go through puberty from 10 to 14 years of age, right, Nalisa? Our body starts secreting these hormones that causes this automatic change. Now, it's a change, but it's not anything that depends upon our environment. Instead, it's genetically programmed. That's what we'll call maturation. Okay. On the other hand, the other kind of change that happens is what we'll call learning or nurture, if you will. And so you went to first grade, Nalisa, they taught you how to read and write. You learned math in second and third grade, and you learned calculus at some point. You are also a product of learning. We're going to first talk a little bit about maturation. I personally think some people think that my face from 5 until now. You know what? You do look super duper young, Nalisa, but don't feel bad about that, because one day you will be 54, just like Dr. Roddenberry, and you'll be happy if you look 10 years younger than you really are, okay? So enjoy that young face. I remember I was carded for alcohol until I was 30 years old because I looked so young. So hopefully you do the same. Now, let's talk specifically about what happens, how important it is when you're pregnant. Now, this puts a lot more pressure on the females than it does the male because you carry the baby. But unfortunately, there are some things that you need to think about if you want to get your baby off to a good start. You can think about this as sort of the combination of nature and nurture, Nalisa. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard this word teratogens. Teratogens are the words we use to describe anything that can harm your developing baby. You know how they say smoking harms your unborn baby and it causes low birth weight? Smoking, nicotine is a teratogen. You know how they say if you drink alcohol, your baby might be born with fetal alcohol syndrome? Alcohol is a teratogen. Anything that can pass through the placenta, the maternal blood barrier, and get into the baby and mess up that baby's developing is known as a teratogen, okay? Smoking's a teratogen, alcohol's a teratogen, illicit drugs are a teratogen. It turns out some acne medications can be a teratogen. In fact, if you're thinking about getting pregnant, and you are a female, you should contact your doctor to let them know what sort of medications you are on, because some of these medications can pass through the placenta and harm a developing baby. And so you probably ought to know that if you want to have a healthy baby. Now, what determines whether or not a teratogen hurts your baby? In fact, it turns out my mom smoked the whole time that she was pregnant with me. And nothing happened to me, right? So nothing happened to me. I'm completely normal. Now, why not? Why do some people get away with it and some people don't? Well, it depends upon the amount that you smoked. My mom smoked a lot of cigarettes. It also depends upon the genetic susceptibility. Some people are genetically sensitive to more chemicals than others. So it's those two things. And the third thing is really what I want to talk about, and it's this idea of timing. The reason I talk about timing is because it allows me to tell you a really cool thing about how human beings develop in the womb. Look at this this little graph underneath me, Nalisa. Now here's the deal. They divide pregnancy into 3 stages: the germinal phase, the embryonic phase, and the fetal phase. Now, the germinal phase is when the little fertilized egg floats down the fallopian tube and embeds in the uterine wall and begins to develop a placenta. And that's sort of the first stage, and that only takes 2 weeks. And then the fetal stage starts at about, I think, 10 weeks, and that's really when the baby just grows. Now, the important part, what I want you to know, is there's that period from 2 weeks to 10 weeks. It's called the embryonic period. And this is when all of the systems in the human being begin to develop. It's when the brains and the lungs and the heart begin to develop. It's when the arms begin to develop. It's when the eyes and the ears. It's when everything really forms, if you will. And from 2 to 10 weeks in your mom's belly, all of your systems are going to begin to develop. They're going to appear. And at 10 weeks of age, if we look at that little developing baby, it's going to not quite look like a human, but it's going to have all of the parts of a human, eyes, nose. You're going to be able to see all of those body parts and all of those organs. They will have started by 10 weeks. Now, why do I tell you this? It's because it turns out that the effect that a teratogen have kind of depends on when you take it. If you take drugs, and let's say it's during the first 2 weeks, your baby's just liable not to implant well, and it's liable to miscarry. If, on the other hand, you're exposed to teratogens from 2 to 10 weeks, you're going to get, maybe the baby's going to miscarry, or you're going to get those horrible birth defects where an arm or a limb or something's not going to grow right or grow completely. And then from 12 weeks and on, what's going to happen is the organ and system will have developed normally, but it might not function properly, or the baby might not gain weight. So what happens when I take some sort of teratogenic substance? Well, it depends on how much you take. It depends on how genetically sensitive the baby is. And it also depends on when you take it. Because during pregnancy, we have sort of these three things happening. When the developing embryo establishes itself, first 2 weeks, then the next 8 weeks when all of the baby systems just, if you will, rupture and begin to develop. And then the last weeks when basically all these systems mature and when they grow. Now, what you'll notice is if you look at this chart underneath me, the green is the time when that developing system is most sensitive to a teratogen. After that, the teratogen is not as damaging to that system. Now, the purple line tells you how long it takes until that body part is done developmentally in terms of biologically done. And what you're going to see is that a lot of the body parts are actually going to be done by 8 to 10 weeks. But you'll notice some take longer to fully mature. And in fact, I will tell you that your brain, your nervous system isn't fully done growing, Nelisa, until you are 25 years of age. Nelisa, you're not 25 yet. I know that because you're young. Your frontal lobe is still not done growing. Okay? Now, one of the things that we really worry about is low birth weight, okay? Because if you look at longitudinal studies, what you're going to find is that low birth weight is associated with a lot of negative outcomes later in life. Academic problems, behavioral problems for the children, drug and alcohol problems. There's higher incidence of these negative outcomes that we want in life. So one of the things that doctors are really worried about is low birth weight. In fact, Nelisa, you may not know this, but occasionally mothers do come into a doctor's care, and these mothers are hooked on OxyContin or some sort of opioid. And the question is, if the mom is born, that baby will be addicted to an opioid, okay? On the other hand, if we try to wean the mother off the opioid, it's liable to cause the baby to be born early. And sometimes what doctors will do is they'll use I forget that drug that they use for opioid, not that you have to take every day, Suboxone, I forget what it's called, but they'll actually put you on drug maintenance and the baby will be born addicted a little bit to Oxycontin or to opioids, and then they wean the newborn baby off because they are less worried. The outcomes are worse for a baby that's low birth weight compared to a baby that's born addicted to opioids. So low birth weight is something that really, really worries doctors. And you're going to see that with smoking, and you're also going to see that with alcohol use during pregnancy. And of course, if the mother's alcohol use is high enough, you may even see fetal alcohol syndrome, which is going to cause facial deformities. As I said, we're not going to get the proper growth of the body structures, as well as intellectual problems and all of these other academic problems. Now, what I'm introducing you to right now with those green lines, Melissa, is the idea of what we call a critical period. It turns out that the developing nervous system, the developing human, the biological system is very sensitive at different times to different kinds of stimulation. This is a negative critical period. If your body is exposed to drugs from 2 to 10 weeks of gestation, you may have these bad problems with these functional problems and these what we call these birth defects, right? Now, it turns out that there are going to be critical periods along your life when it's necessary for things to happen in order for you to develop normally. When we talk about language, and I forget which chart I'm talking about, we're going to talk about Jeannie, the wild child. She was not exposed to language until she was 11 years of age. And unfortunately, she missed her critical period for language and was never able to develop the ability to speak normally. So the ability to speak normally, this language acquisition device that I mentioned last episode, remember I talked about the language acquisition device, Noam Chomsky. That language acquisition device, it's a competency in your brain, but it has to be stimulated before you're 2 or 3 years old, or you will actually lose the ability to learn language. So it's very important. One of the things that developmental psychologists has taught us is that human beings, the developing nervous system, has critical periods when it is very sensitive to the environment. We need to pay attention to these critical environments. It's also taught us how to avoid things that may help our developing baby. If you remember on the other slide, I said that the average lifespan is now 77 and not 47, and that is because infant mortality is much, much lower than it was 120 years ago. It turned out a long time ago, when we didn't know about this, a lot of babies would be born with severe birth defects because their parents didn't know and ingested these things that hurt the developing baby. Because we know about that now, we educate mothers. Mothers can avoid these things, and the likelihood of having a baby with severe congenital birth defects and dying during the first year have greatly, greatly decreased. Now, having said that, Melissa, I will tell you that the most dangerous year of life for a human being in their first 50 years of life is the first year of life. You are most likely to die your first year of life than you are for the next 40 or 50 years. It turns out that it's because some babies come with these, and it's because babies are born with birth defects, congenital abnormalities, or just congenital problems, heart defects, and other things. That so the likelihood of dying is really, really young, and that's why postnatal care is incredibly important. You have to get your baby into the doctor ASAP right after birth so that the doctor can keep an eye on that baby. Okay. All right. Hopefully that's interesting. I droned on a little more than I want. Now, the maturation. Now, it turns out that your nervous system is going to change 2 ways, Melissa. You are changing 2 ways right now. The first is myelination, and the second is synaptic blooming and pruning. Now, One of these represents maturation, and one of these represents the environment or experience. The first, myelination, is maturational. This is the natural growth of myelin tissue around your axons. If you remember from chapter 3, the second module we did, I forget what it was called, the one about the brain. I suggested to you that around every axon we have this stuff called myelin tissue that insulates the neuron. Now, it turns out that when human beings are born, their head, in order to get your head through the birth canal, your brain needs to be small enough to get through the birth canal. However, you have a lot of brain areas that need to develop before you can be born. So what happens is your brain is not born with the myelin tissue that's going to go around the axons. And if you'll notice, newborn infants are completely helpless, right? They can't do anything. And that's because none of their neurons are myelinated. As the myelin grows around these neurons, Nalisa, the abilities that part of the brain controls begin to work. So you'll notice that children about 4 or 5 months of age can grab a rattle and their hands finally work. And then children around 10 months of age can stand up on their legs because the neurons that control their legs finally work. And then children around 12 months or 14 months will say their first word, and that's because the neurons that control their language begin to myelinate. So one of the things that happens as we mature is our brain grows this fatty tissue. And you can actually go in with an MRI scan or a CT scan, which shows you myelination, and you can actually sort of gauge how old a person is based upon how much myelin you can see when you image their brain. And it is very predictable how this occurs. What happens is the parts of your brain that are dark colored myelinate first, and the parts that are light colored myelinate last. Now let me give you a cool little thing. This back part is your visual center. Your eyes start working really early. This part right here in the middle is your motor center. You start moving around and walking pretty early in your life, right? And this is your acoustic center, so you can hear things. But you know what part starts working a little bit later? Your memory down here, this white spot on the bottom. And that's why little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds don't have very good memory. And then this spot sort of towards the back of your brain is your complex thinking part of your brain, where you do critical thinking and solve complex math problems. And that starts a little bit later. And then Lisa, this is the part of your brain that myelinates the last, and that's the frontal lobe. In fact, Nalisa, you're 18, so this part of your brain is the one that's not done myelinating yet. Now, I have my friend Ron Moose in here. Ron, how you doing? He's a former student from several months ago. See students stop in all the time. My man from, was it Jamaica, was it? Ron, how you doing? Good to see you. And hi, Jen, good to see you as well. Wow, this is like old timers day in class. What I'm trying to do is to explain a little bit about maturation to them, Jen and Ron. And I'm explaining that the myelination happens in this pre-programmed pattern. And so when you see little children, what you're going to notice is that their abilities are going to change in this very organized pattern. Kids are going to see quickly, then they're going to get up and start walking, then they're going to start remembering things, then they're going to start solving problems, and then they're really going to be able to sit down and focus and study. And this sort of occurs in a pre-programmed process. All right, so this is maturation. Now we're going to change that from another biological change you can actually see in the brain. Now, this relates to what happens when a neuron stimulates another neuron. If you remember from the biological chapter, I suggested to you that neurons communicate by secreting neurotransmitters which stimulate other neurons. And these neurotransmitters either cause another neuron to activate or it causes another neuron to slow down its activity. And so your brain has these chemicals coursing through as neurons stimulate other neurons. Well, the neat thing is, I didn't mention this, when one neuron stimulates another neuron, not only does it stimulate it with neurotransmitter, but it provides it with glutamate, which is kind of like a fertilizer. And it causes this other neuron to start growing more spikes that sort of grow towards this neuron that stimulates it. And if it keeps getting stimulated, it's going to keep growing and it's going to get more connections and it's going to develop a better connection to this. And what we'll call that is synaptic growth. So as neurons stimulate one another, these neurons begin to grow together and knit together. We call this synaptic blooming. Now, you've probably heard the statement, use it or lose it. That also relates to these synaptic connections, because as I suggested to you, if this synaptic connection develops and it grows a bunch of synapses, and then this synapse quits sending messages, these synapses are going to start to die slowly but surely. And that's what we call pruning. And so what happens as you play with your child and tell them stories and play songs for them and show them colors and animals, what you're doing, Nelisa, is you're stimulating these different parts of your brain and you're causing them to grow together. And as they grow together, they begin to work. Now, the cool thing is, Nelisa, is that your brain's going to grow 10 pathways to do a job. But it's going to find the best of those 10 pathways, and that's the only one it's going to use. And then the other 9 pathways are going to slowly die off because they aren't as useful. And so what you're going to see as you stimulate a baby's brain is its architecture is going to change. It's going to build roads through the brain that connect different spots as effectively as possible. And it's going to create multiple connections, and it's going to find the one that works the best, and then the others are going to die off. So in a sense, your brain is going to kind of create its own unique architecture based upon your brain and the environment that you find yourself in. Now, we call this sort of flexible change of the brain neuroplasticity, Nelisa, neuroplasticity. And the neat thing about this is if your brain is damaged for some reason, another part of your brain can take over that body part and start controlling it. On the other hand, if a part of your body is missing, the part of the brain that controls that can find something else to do. So it's not just sitting around, right? So what we need to know about brains is that your nervous system is changing. It's never done. In fact, the neuroplasticity and the synaptic blooming and pruning probably never goes away. But your brain is changing over your entire lifespan. Some of it's programmed, as in when you get this fatty tissue that makes parts of your brain work better. And the other is related to your ability to stimulate your brain. So the fact that I'm getting better with my fingers is that I keep practicing. So that little spot in my brain that controls my fingers when I play a guitar is getting better and better, right? And so your brain is never changing. You should always keep learning for that very reason, all right? Now, here's the deal. One of the things that we know based on neuroplasticity is that the younger a brain is, the more it can adapt and change, right? You know how they say you can't teach an old dog new tricks? That's not true, but it is easier to teach a new dog, a young dog, new tricks than it is to teach an old dog. So, if there is a problem with your brain, there are interventions that doctors and developmental psychologists and pediatricians can do to help you. For example, if your child is autistic, there are interventions that can help your child with these this difficulty in the social sphere. If your child has a speech problem, if your child has a hearing problem, if your child has a motor problem, the earlier you address the problem, the better chance you have of achieving normal outcomes later in life. Does that make sense, Nelisa? The earlier we see a problem, the more we can use the principle of neuroplasticity to fix that problem. Now, in order to do this, we need a way to evaluate the quality of our child's development. And this is why we take our child to the pediatrician for regular checkups starting at birth. Your first checkup's even going to be 2 weeks after birth, and you need to hit these checkups. Why do we hit these checkups? Well, because your doctor, along with taking your child's physical symptoms, physical measures like listening to their heart and listening to their little tummy, they're also checking for milestones. And a milestone is an ability or growth or quality that can be measured in a developing human being to see if that human being is progressing on time. So this guy named Arnold Giselle came upon the insight way back in the 1930s that most children develop similar abilities at similar times. If you look at this chart underneath me, what you're going to see is that children lift their head probably about 6 weeks of age. Most children are going to be sitting up around without support by about 5 months. Most children are going to be able to walk holding on to something at around 10 months. And he realized that children's abilities open in a very predictable fashion. And he called these predictable behaviors milestone behaviors. And he realized that if you know what is expected, you can look at children and see if that child has a developmental problem. Does that make sense, Nelissa? Okay. And so it's too expensive to use. Your insurance company's not going to let us use PET scans and CT scans to see if your baby's brain's developing normally. But we don't need that. All we need to do is watch these milestone behaviors. And if your child is not hitting milestone behaviors, then we begin to wonder. Now, a couple things I want to mention. Infants start out, the milestones that infants start out with are what's known as infant reflexes. And these are just natural reflexes that the child has that are adaptive, and they stay there for about the first 6 months until the myelination takes over, and then they should disappear if your child is healthy. So all children, Melissa, are born with a sucking reflex. If you put something in a 2-year-old's mouth, it will immediately start sucking it. That is a feeding reflex that helps the baby survive until its brain center develops the ability to allow it to swallow food. Right? You also have another feeding instinct. If you stroke a baby's breast, like it might feel if it's rubbed up against a mom's breast, if you rub a baby's cheek, it will turn and begin looking for something to suck. So the rooting and sucking reflex are feeding reflexes. If your baby's normal, they're going to have these and a bunch of other what we call infant reflexes. And these reflexes will go away as your child develops their normal abilities. And in fact, there's a normal social milestone. Your child's going to engage in their first real smile about 3 or 4 months of age. Kids have a reflexive grimace that kind of looks like a smile, but you're not going to get that big old happy smile until about the age of 4 months. Now, if your baby is 10 months of age or a year and they still haven't smiled, and they're not interested in making eye contact with you, your child is missing their socio-emotional milestones, and your child may have autism. So do you see how that works, Nalissa? So there are motor, what you're looking at beneath me are what we call gross motor milestone behaviors that let us know that the big muscles are working. Then there are fine motor milestones that develop a little bit later, like being able to do this and to do this and to write with a pencil. That's very helpful in school, fine motor behaviors. Then there are cognitive milestones, being able to follow directions. Typically, a 4 or 5 month old should follow something with their eyes. If they don't, that might be a cognitive problem. They're socio-emotional, which tell us if your child may be autistic or not. And then we have language milestones, which we can see. Most children are going to say their first word around 12 to 14 months. Now, having said that, I bring up this milestone expectations. The crazy thing is some children will not say their first word until 18 months. Well, Dr. Roddenberry, you said they have to say their first word around 12 months. Well, here's the deal. The first thing I should tell you about milestones is their general expectations. And just like some of you are always late to class, some of you are going to always be late to your milestones. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, you're just late. In fact, the doctor really uses the numbers, the age expectations, as a general guideline. As long as your child's moving along at a steady pace, if they're 3 months behind, but they're always moving, your doctor is not going to be worried at all. And language is especially fluid. Sometimes if your parents do too much for the child and do everything for them and kind of helicopter parent a little bit, the child doesn't need to speak. Everything's done for it. And so some children won't speak till a little bit later. So there's big variability. But these ideas, this just gives your doctor and you something to look at as your child's developing. If your child is a month or two late or 3 months late, but keeps progressing through milestones, your child's cool. If your child starts progressing through milestones and suddenly stops and doesn't make any more milestones for 3 or 4 or 5 months, that's worrisome. If your child hits a milestone, children, especially autistic children, will have some social milestones and then back up. So the child may have a social smile at 4 months, may be making eye contact at 8 months, and then at 10 months, the kid quits making eye contact. And at 12 months, the kid not only quits making eye contact, but quits smiling again. That would be a problematic milestone progression for a doctor. But milestones take advantage of the fact that human beings' brains mature. This myelination occurs in a predictable fashion, which leads to predictable behaviors, which allows us to make sure that your child is developing healthy. And that's why we go to the pediatrician. Yeah, they look at your weight to see if you're hitting your weight gain milestones. They look at your height to see if you're hitting your height milestones. And in fact, if you're not hitting your milestones, your pediatrician may even use the word failure to thrive. Have you ever heard that word? We say that infants and children are thriving if they're getting bigger and they're hitting milestones. One of the things that we see in impoverished countries or countries that are war torn or torn by civil war or stuff like that, you will see that there is a failure to thrive on the part of the children. You'll go there and children will be 30 and 40 pounds underweight. They won't be able to do things that other children do. What we have is a failure to thrive there. And so that's a term you may even see. One of the things that sometimes we see with children who are low birth weight is that they have trouble hitting these milestones. Children of low birth weight sometimes experience failure to thrive, which is they're not progressing through their milestones as much as the doctor would like to see. Did I bore you enough with developmental psychology? But do you understand how the nervous system changes? It's this evolutionary process. No, there's not always signs in autism in babies. No, exactly. Jen Bird, that is a very good point. No, the only time you're going to see it that young is if the child has a serious autism. But in a sense, you may begin to suspect it when your child's not doing things that other 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds are doing. That's a great question. No, the deal is only the more severe developmental delays will appear at 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 months. If we see it then, it's usually pretty severe. But what you're going to notice is that sometimes it'll take a first grade school counselor or a second grade teacher to begin noticing the problem. And that's when these diagnoses are disordered. And so that's why you'll see what we call learning disorders. That's a great question. Great question. Okay. Now, again, this idea with dendritic blooming and pruning. One of the things that I never understood when I went to Walmart to buy presents, toys for kids, when I had kids, I wasn't as knowledgeable about developmental psychology. And if you look at the aisles, they have them by age group, the 0 to 1 educational toys, 1 to 3 educational toys. And I always used to look at the 0 to 1 and I would say, how is a light up ball educational? How is a block educational? How is anything that just, and the deal is educational for a 0 to 1-year-old is just stimulation. So again, what you're trying to do is to grow those dendrites. So if you want to educate your kid, if you have 2 languages, if you're and you want to speak 2 languages home, that's cool. But don't feel the need to buy a language kit for your infant. Don't feel the need to start teaching your kid math. If you want a healthy child, you know what you do? You play with them, stimulate that brain, sing them songs, play games with them, show them things, laugh, tickle them, touch them, pick them up, show them, let them touch things. That's how you educate a 0 to 1-year-old child. You just stimulate that brain. So I want you to know that so that you have healthy children. What to do when you're pregnant, and what to do, good well baby care for the first several years of your life. And it is very important, especially for the first couple years of life. In fact, I don't know, have you any ever heard this? You give your children whole milk for the first 2 years of their life and then switch to 2% milk. Some people say 2% milk is healthier for human beings because it has less fat. This is true. Before the age of 2 years, kids need extra fat to help myelinate that brain. And it's all about this developmental psychology. All right. Now, one quick thing I do want to mention, yes, we are going to get old, and yes, brains do change as we get older. One of the neat things that was done, it's like I think this study's been going on for probably about 60 or 70 years now. They've been following people of different ages over a longitudinal study. Longitudinal study means I ask you at different times. So I'll ask every 7 years, they go back and give these people IQ tests. And what they did was they did a cross-sequential design. They got people of different ages, 25-year-olds, 32-year-olds, 39-year-olds, 46-year-olds, and then they followed these people of different ages and they measured them every 7 years. So we have people of different age groups being measured every 7 years. And they measured people's IQ scores to see how people's intellectual abilities changed as they moved from childhood into early adulthood, into middle adulthood, into late adulthood. And what they found was that IQ, or your intellectual abilities, do change. They top out in middle adulthood and even begin to decline. But the weird thing is, this led them to an insight about intellectual abilities and IQ tests. Not all the items on the IQ test show declines, okay? Only a certain set of items on the IQ test showed declines when we were in our 50s and 60s. Now, if you look at these different items, what they found is that the items that showed the most decline in middle and late adulthood was those tasks on an IQ test that required the person to be flexible or creative in their thinking or to think quickly. And so they term these types of intellectual abilities your fluid intelligence. So, but what they found is that people's knowledge for facts, their knowledge for multiplication tables, their knowledge for concepts, their ability to answer general knowledge questions did not seem to change even late into adulthood. And they said, you know what? These represent crystallized facts or crystallized intelligence. So, an interesting way to think about IQ tests is IQ tests measure how flexible and quick your brain is, and in a sense, what kind of information your brain has in it. And what you're going to see as you move into my age, into the mid 50s, into the 60s, I'm not going to think as fast as I did, and I'm not going to be as creative as I used to. But I still know what I know, what I know, what I know, and that's going to stay around. So when you look at people and you say, what's the natural progression of cognitive decline in your grandparents? You know what? They're not going to be as good at solving problems. You need to help them when the plumbing breaks down because they're not going to be able to figure it out. They're going to be a little bit slower to think, and they're not going to make decisions, and they're going to talk slower. But they're still going to know things, and they shouldn't really be forgetting basic kinds of things. That would be abnormal cognitive decline in adulthood. And we have sort of an umbrella term to talk about all the different types of abnormal memory loss that we have, which typically occurs later in adulthood. And this is what we call dementia. Now, dementia is abnormal memory loss, and you can have abnormal memory loss at any age, but typically we talk about dementia with regard to getting older, and that is where you're more commonly going to see it. Now, if you look down below, I've got some stuff here, just some basic knowledge for you. Alzheimer's disease is the most common type of dementia in later adulthood. I don't have time. If you want a webinar this week, I can tell you what happens. It turns out the microtubules in your brain, the little proteins that make up the structure of your neuron cells, start going wacky and crazy and overproducing things, and they create these tangles in your brain that causes your brain cells to die. And when you lose brain cells, you lose memory ability. So Alzheimer's disease, which is a form of cell death, dementia related to cell death, it's the most common type that you're going to see later in adulthood. Typically, it's going to occur after 65, and we have a special name for those of people who see it before the age of 65. Once you have it, it's progressive and incurable. And you might say, oh my God, what can I do? Well, here's the deal. We can't prevent it, you can't stop it, but there are things that decrease the risk of it happening to you. You need to get outside and exercise. Jog would be great, play pickleball would be great, pick up basketball. For goodness sake, walk. All you have to do is walk. So aerobic exercise is great for the delay of dementia. The other thing that you can do is what Dr. Roddenberry is doing right now. You can learn an instrument, or you can learn to habla español, right? Learn another language. So in order to protect the things that protect us from dementia, even though we can't stop it, we can decrease our likelihood is by exercising and by learning, keeping our brain engaged, right? The guitar is so cool. I wish I didn't suck on it, and I wish I hadn't waited until I was an old man to learn it. But that's a different story, Melissa. Oh my God, I've ran out of time, and I am completely not going to be able to talk about behaviors. So I'm going to leave that to you to talk about. Behaviorism represents the exact opposite of what we've been talking about. Behaviorism represents the change that occurs because we learn things. If you folks have ever trained a dog to shake hands or a dog to sit down, if you've ever had your parents take your car keys or your cell phone away for being bad, if you've ever had your parents give you money for making A's in school, if you've ever earned extra credit, Your behavior and your thinking has changed as a result of rewards in the environment. There's a whole branch of psychology known as behaviorism, whose job is to try to understand how people's behavior changes as a result of experience. This is not biological, this is not nature. This would be those people who call themselves nurturists. And in fact, the people like John Watson would call themselves radical behaviorists. They would say that all people are born, in a sense, equal, and the only difference between people is how their environment shaped them. So John Watson said, give me any child with a normal nervous system, of normal neurological, free of birth defects, and I will train that child to be anything I want. Doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, beggarman, thief, I will train that child to be whatever I want. This represents a harsh departure from Charles Darwin, from social Darwinism, from genetics. These people believed that if you really wanted to understand humans were, you had to understand how their environment affected the way they behave. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it to you. This is tricky because this is not the easiest part of psychology, but I've run out of time. I want you to learn about the two vehicles, the two models by which people's behavior changes. There are two ways in which we have found the environment can reliably predict behavior change. Okay, the first is operant conditioning, which is when people are rewarded or punished, and the second is what we call classical condition. Yes, like Tarzan, absolutely. Uh, it's kind of interesting. You should mention that, Sandy. Tarzan is completely physical culture, but Tarzan is the thought experiment that we cannot reliably do. If you take a human and bring them up in a world of apes, will that person be more of a human, or will they, which is what they were born to be, or will they be an ape because that's what they were born to be? Now, it's interesting you should mention that. Very interesting thought, Tarzan, Sandeep. It turns out that there are examples of people, case studies of children who have been abandoned by humans and brought up by animals. Read about Oksana, the dog girl from Russia, and read about Ginny, the wild child. Those are two examples of children that were ignored when they were early. Actually, Oksana, the wolf girl, would be better. She was actually raised and cared for by a pack of dogs. Okay, and then there was an experiment, a case study where researchers took a chimp, which you can do, and took it away from its chimp mother and brought it up into a human. And what they found is that there are some boundaries you can't cross. However, if you read this these few PowerPoints that I have about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, I can tell you about the ways in which we can show people's behaviors are affected by the environment. You know what? I will finish this up on Thursday when we do Born This Way too, and so we'll finish up these chapters. I do apologize for not getting through it. This is just so much information. It's so interesting, and you had questions. Some African communities communicate with birds for hunting. Wow, and it's amazing that you can train a bird to do that. That's a really cool idea. All right, folks, I've run all out of time. However, I promise you I will be back on Thursday to finish this article. Sandeep, thank you for coming. Nelisa, thank you for coming. Jen, thank you very much for coming. And Ron, I'm sure you probably bounced out now, but it's always nice to have former students stop by and say hello. If we can exercise, yes, the key is to get the heart rate up, Nelisa. The key is to get the heart rate up into the cardio range, 130 to 140 beats a minute. If you can do that 2.5 hours a week. Get yourself a very good brisk walk, a half an hour a day, 5 to 6 days a week, and you can practice yourself. Most people will wait till they have their first medical emergency, like I did late in my 40s, and then they will see the light. I lost 60 pounds and started exercising and eating healthy, but I had to have a medical emergency for that to happen. What I'm going to tell you is most of your friends are going to wait and have the same thing, and you're going to be around your 50-year-old friends trying to live healthy. But if you take my advice, you'll start doing it now, and then you won't have to have the heart palpitations. You won't have to have the little bitty cancer episode. You won't have to have the high blood pressure. So take care of it now, and you'll be a happier. Fresh hair is definitely the key. Yes, yes, yes. And Americans have ruined themselves by becoming cooped up in their houses with their cell phones playing with social media. And I myself am guilty sometimes. All right, folks, it's been absolutely great seeing you. Thank you very much for your great questions, your comments. Sandeep, thank you for coming to us from Jaipur, India. And it is always good to see you, folks. And I will see you next Thursday at 1 p.m. sharp. Take care, folks. Bye.